Hello everyone! Been getting a lot of questions about web swinging, so I'm making this tutorial on how I personally tackle it. Before we begin, I need to clarify. I animate at 15 frames per second, and I use the programs DragonFrame to animate and Adobe Premiere Pro to edit. Alright, let's go. When animating the web swing, there are a few things you need to keep track of. A. Spider-Man's position. B. Spider-Man's pose. And C. The web itself. Let's start with the web. You may notice that recently, I tend to use these stringy web pieces to animate Spidey swinging, and a couple people have been asking, how can they too keep this flimsy Lego piece still during shots? My solution is to make sure both ends of the string are attached to something when you need to animate it. The web should always be attached to a building or a structure above Spider-Man, and on the other end, you should attach the web to Spider-Man. Spider-Man is now the anchor for the web. Where he goes, the web goes. The structure also needs to be high enough so that way when Spider-Man swings on it, he can stay well above the ground at all times. Once you have both points attached, you actually have a lot more control over the middle of the web than you may think. Now you may notice I have Spider-Man attached to this mechanism. This is a rig. In order to do any kind of web swinging at all, you need to know about masking. It's how we make things fly in stop motion. I have a video on it right here in case you don't know what masking is, or how to do it. Now there will be a point where Spider-Man lets go of the web. At that point, I create an entirely new rig to attach the web to. And then, I animate it falling into place. And I remove the rig in editing. Sometimes you get lucky, and the web is close enough to a building where you can just use sticky tack to attach the web to a wall and animate it like that. No masking required. Bada bing bada boom. It's actually not that hard to animate these stringy pieces. Think of it like this. If you can control both ends of the string, you can control the entire thing. Now next up is Spider-Man himself, and he's a bit more complicated. Let's get started with his positioning. When looking at Spider-Man swinging, it's important to note three distinct actions: the downswing, the upswing, and the web spin. And then, we loop back to the downswing. In its most basic form, this is what web swinging is. Spider-Man is a pendulum, like a grandfather clock or a swing set. He attaches a web to a high vantage point and lets gravity do the rest. But to get a better understanding, let's try and analyze a short loop I made for this tutorial. If we spread all the frames and look at them at the same time like this, there are a few key ideas here that I think are very important. First off, notice the curvature and the trajectory of Spider-Man swinging. When animating, I have this philosophy. It's all about the arc. By that I mean, the arc of the motion. Each individual frame has to follow a path set out by the previous one. If Spider-Man dips down in this direction for one frame, then he has to keep dipping down in that exact same direction for the next few, until his momentum wears off and he can change direction once again. Now that is pretty much true for all animation, or at least that's what I keep in mind when I'm animating. If one frame is just a little off, it can make the animation look a bit janky or awkward. Keeping to the arc is how we get nice, smooth motions. If you have a program like DragonFrame, where you can switch back between the last frame you took and the current one you are taking, make sure you switch back and forth constantly to ensure you're following the right trajectory. A lot of stop motion is trial and error. Sometimes it takes me like 10 minutes to move on to the next frame, just because of how many times I have to reattempt a pose. But then, there's also stuff like weight and momentum. How do we convey that? If you look closely, you'll notice there are multiple frames where the Spider-Men are really close together, and their poses are similar to each other. These frames are when he loses momentum. He's a little slower here, because he's used up all the previous energy to move to this point. Frames like this are the most important. Not only does it help the audience, but it also gives Spider-Man a nice sense of weight. It adds that extra oomph to his swing. Take for example this moment, where I treat Spidey's web more like a bungee cord, so he can dip down real low, and then shoot back up. That was only possible because for these 4 frames, I virtually had Spider-Man in the same spot, but I did have his body continue a movement path. As you can see, his head moves forward, his legs move back, and they get ready to flip forward. Just like that. I typically slow down Spidey's web swinging around the apex of his jump, when he's at his very highest in between webs, getting ready to spin another one. I think slowing him down here makes sense, because he's at the very height of his swing. All of the force and the speed that he's gained from the downswing leads up to here. It's a natural slowdown in his momentum before gravity's unflinching grip takes hold of him once again. Then, the downswing happens. And this is typically the fastest part of the web swing, because he's falling. Now to convey a faster movement, all you gotta do is just expand the gaps in between your frames a little bit, as you can see here. After his downswing ends, and he curves upward, you need to make sure the movements get tinier and tinier. Because like we discussed earlier, that's how we convey the loss of momentum, and that's when we have to lead into the next major action. In this case, it's when he spins his web again. Now everything I just told you about the positioning of Spider-Man during his swing also applies to the way you need to pose him in each frame. Obviously while he's swinging, you want his arms, legs, and body to move around and rotate. He needs to steer himself while he swings. He can't just stand still. Nobody does that. On his downswing, if his body is facing forward, have his legs dangle behind him. Then you can make them kick forward as he's trying to swing back up. Sometimes Spider-Man pulls himself by his web using his arm. and sometimes he does a little flip off of a jump. When he spins another web again, make sure you lead into a strong pose. Think of it like this. If Spider-Man was completely pitch black in the frame, would the audience still be able to recognize the pose? You have to make sure that the poses you choose to slow down are the strongest ones. Every pose in between these strong poses acts as a vehicle to get to your character from one key pose to the next. The rig you use is also important. You want to use something that gives you a lot of maneuverability in the air. This is what I use. It's a helping hand with a bit of Lego attached to it. It gives me a lot of freedom with Spider-Man depending on how I attach him to the rig. Here's another alternative I use, in case you just have Lego bricks lying around. Make sure you experiment and find out what works best for you. But whatever he does, it's up to you. As long as you're giving him strong poses to work with, and you remember the fundamentals, you should be fine. Just remember to slow it down at the right times, and to speed it up when it makes sense. And also make sure you always follow the arc, no matter what. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic. For now, enjoy this loop of Spider-Man swinging. By the way, this took me about 5 hours to make, so make sure you're patient too. There's no easy ways, but that's how you know it's worth it. Thank you all again for watching. Please let me know if you found this tutorial helpful in any way. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments. I can't respond to all of them, but I'll try to get to as many as I can. And of course, thank you to my Patreons, who have been supporting me since like day one. Well, not all of them, but you know what I mean. They've been supporting me, and that's huge. So I want to say thank you again to them, very much. And I'll see you guys next time.